Lesson 1.9 is on dividing rational numbers. It starts on page 57. We're going to skip over to page 58. So lesson 9, dividing rational numbers, example 1. Yakimo has a drip hose attached to a rain barrel for her garden. The water drains from the rain barrel at a constant rate. What is the change of the volume of water after 1 minute? So you can see from the picture here, the water's going down by 3 3/5 gallons in 6 minutes. Basically, we want to find a unit right here, how many gallons per minute. So gallons divided by minutes. So negative 3 3/5 divided by 6 is what we need to do here. Negative 3 3/5, we're going to need to change to an improper fraction. If you ignore the negative sign, 3 times 5 is 15, plus the 3 on top is 18. So 18/5, negative 18/5 divided by 6, we can put as 6 over 1. And then remember, dividing is keep, change, reciprocal. So we keep the first fraction the same. We change the division to multiplication. Reciprocal of 6 over 1 is 1/6. And then if you want to multiply straight across, you can. I like to have that negative sign up with the numerator, just so it doesn't blend in with our fraction bar. Makes it more visible there. Multiply straight across, you get negative 18 over 30. And then you can reduce both of those actually by 6. If you don't see it, maybe reduce by 2, then reduce by 3. And so negative 3/5, which means that the volume of the water is going down by 3/5 of a gallon every minute. So to try it, suppose the volume of the water in the rain barrel decreased by 4 5/8 gallons in 4 minutes. What will be the change in the volume after 1 minute? So just like on the first example we looked at, basically we're trying to find the unit right here. So we can divide. We want to find out how many gallons per minute, so we'll divide our gallons by minutes. So negative 4 5/8 gallons divided by 4 minutes is going to give us how many gallons per minute, which is gallons per 1 minute. So to work this out, we're going to need to change the negative 4 5/8 to an improper fraction. Remember, ignore the negative sign and then just stick it up in your numerator after you've changed it to an improper fraction. So if we change that to an improper fraction, 4 times 8 is 32, plus 5 is 37/8, and this is going to be a negative. So negative 37/8. We can come back over here to where they're working this out, I guess. I'd like the negative to be up in the numerator so it doesn't accidentally get lost with my fraction bar. Remember, the 4 you can put over 1, and then dividing we do keep, change, reciprocal. So we're going to keep that fraction, first one the same, change to multiplication, and then the reciprocal of 4 over 1 would be 1/4. So at this point, multiplying, we have an option of reducing factors if we have a factor in the numerator and denominator. That could reduce. We actually don't. I kind of, again, don't really like that negative off to the side. That's not how I write my fractions, so I'm going to go ahead and stick it up in the numerator. And then we'll just multiply straight across. The denominator, they already told us 8 times 4 is 32. Negative 37 times 1 would be negative 37. I'm going to keep that negative up in my numerator here. So we've got negative 37 over 32. We know it's going to be negative, and we can change that to a mixed number by dividing that out. So negative 1 and 5 30-seconds of a gallon, gallons per minute. Okay, so it's going to lose. Since it says it's going to lose, then we could just say 1 and 5 over 30 seconds. By it saying lose, that's the assumption that it's negative. Example 2 looks worse than what it really is because it's a complex fraction, It's just where we have a fraction in the numerator, denominator, or both. In this case, we have fractions in the numerator and the denominator of our fraction. Fraction and a fraction. Okay, so what we can do is, since they're dividing, we can just write this out horizontally. 3 2/3 divided by negative 2/3. And then it's really just the same as what we just did. Change 3 2/3 to an improper fraction. Keep change reciprocal. Multiply across. Reduce or change it to a mixed number. You could, if you wanted to, once you got negative 33/6, you could change that, divide it out, you'll get negative 5 3/6, and then you can reduce that to negative 5 1/2. So look at the try it part A. Basically just like what example 2 was. So we can rewrite this horizontally. It's going to look a little nicer to us, maybe a little more familiar. So we need to change to improper fractions if we have any mixed numbers. So 1 2/5. 1 times 5 is 5, plus 2 is 7/5. Don't get in too big of a hurry here. So I'd recommend go ahead one step, change to improper fractions. Next step, keep change reciprocal. Again, that negative sign there can go with either the numerator or the denominator. I like to keep it in the numerator so I can see it easier. Technically at this point we're multiplying. You have an option of reducing. If you don't reduce that, we'll get negative 35/5. And if we divide that out, negative divided by positive would be a negative, so negative 7 would be our answer. Part B, we've got a little bit of a different problem here because we have decimals instead of fractions. So we've got a few different options on these. One option is we can change these to fractions, which is what I'm probably going to do. Another option would be to divide the decimals. Divide it out. Remember, you can't have a decimal on the outside, so you have to move your decimal points over. Another option would be we could write it as a fraction. We could multiply the numerator and denominator to get rid of the decimals. Like I said, I'm just going to go ahead and write these as fractions. So just think about how we would read these decimals correctly. So if we were writing these as fractions, negative 4/10 is our first decimal. The second one is 25/100. Now some of you may recognize 25/100. That's a quarter or a fourth of a dollar. So if you want to go straight to that, you can. And then the negative 4/10 we can reduce to negative 2/5. You don't have to do any of the reducing. It's just going to give you smaller numbers to work with. Okay, now we're in a pretty good spot. Keep change reciprocal. And we'll get negative 8/5. And if you change that over to a mixed number, would be negative 1 3/5. So negative 1 3/5 would be our answer there. So part D, we have a decimal divided by a mixed number. So probably the easiest option would be changing the decimal to a fraction. Another thing about it on this problem, the negative 1 1/6, if you said, well, I'm going to change that to a decimal and then divide it out. You can do it that way, but I think if you do that, the 1/6 I think is a repeating decimal, so that's really not going to work for you to do it that way. So the decimal is 7/10. The negative 1 1/6, ignore the negative for a minute. 1 times 6 is 6, plus the 1 on top is 7. and this is going to be negative, and then it's division still. Take your time, keep, change reciprocal. I like to keep the negative up with the numerator. Since we're multiplying, if you want to do some reducing here, you can. So if we multiply without reducing, we would get negative 42 over 70. If you look back to what we had, there were 7s in the numerator and denominator, so that would be a clue here that we can reduce both of those by 7. Again, we could have reduced it ahead of time, but this is fine also. Negative 6/10, and then reduced by 2, which would be negative 3/5. Example 3, location of a submarine changes by negative 6/100 of a kilometer each minute. How much time does it take to get to the sea bottom? So if we look at the picture here, we've got negative 3/4 of a kilometer is where the sea bottom is. Basically, a way of looking at it then is, how many times do we have to go down 6/100 of a kilometer till we get to negative 3/4? So that's why they're dividing here. Negative 3/4 divided by negative 6/100. They went ahead and changed the fraction to a decimal. I would probably change the decimal to a fraction. If we do that, it's negative 6/100. If you want to, before you start working that out, you can actually reduce that to negative 3/50. And then we'll keep change reciprocal. And we're going to do a negative times negative is going to be positive. Good. And so this would be 150 over 12. And if you divide that out, we'll get 12 and 6/12, which is 12.5, same as the 12 and 5/10, 12.5 that they got. So 12.5 minutes, it would reach the bottom of the sea. Look at the try it part A. Negative 1 1/3 divided by negative 1 6/10. This one again, 1/3 as a decimal is a repeating decimal, so this is another case where it's going to be better for us to go to fractions rather than decimals. That's always the safest bet, is working with the fractions. So the decimal we can make as negative 1 6/10. If you wanted to, you could reduce that before you get going, negative 1 3/5. You don't have to, just you'll have a little bit bigger numbers. Not a big deal if you don't. So next we can change these to improper fractions. Ignore the negative. 1 times 3 is 3, plus 1 is 4. So negative 4/3. 1 times 5 is 5, plus 3 is 8. So negative 8/5. So keep change reciprocal. Negative 4/3 times negative 5/8. Again, if you want to keep the negative with the 8 there, you can, as long as we keep it with our fraction somewhere, we're okay. When we go to work this out, negative times negative is going to be positive. 4 times 5, 3 times 8. Okay, and then we can reduce, should be able to reduce by 4, looks like. So 5/6 would be our answer for that one.